Andrew Hendry is a professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He is a Canada Research Chair and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Has published more than 200 scientific papers. He is best known for promoting the importance of contemporary, that is rapid, evolution in nature and its effects on ecological patterns and processes. Please welcome Andrew.
You know, it's funny, standing up here right now after dinner, everybody with a little bit of alcohol in them, I just cannot stop thinking about that Batman movie where the Joker comes up the elevator, right, and comes into this group of all these drinking people that are happily living and, you know, like experiencing this reception and say, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, we are tonight's entertainment. So basically that's me tonight, I'm your entertainment. And also, I've certainly given a lot of talks to drunk people before. And it's usually a rewarding experience. And I have actually given talks drunk before, and they've been rewarding for me as well. So I'm giving another go at that tonight. I tried to drink as much wine as possible, but David reined me in. Okay. So what I want to talk to you about is a very earthly thing, and that is the evolution of life on Earth, not just in the past, but as it's unfolding right now. And so I want to talk about what rapid evolution can and can't do for biodiversity, ecosystems, and people as we move forward in this constantly changing world. And I want to start by considering this penguin here. So everybody knows that penguins breed in the coldest environments on Earth, right? Emperor penguins, minus 60 Celsius on the Antarctic continent, and they are basically the most cold-adapted breeding vertebrate anyway, probably of all organisms. Now, interestingly, this penguin is sitting on the equator. So this is a Galapagos penguin. You go to Galapagos, you can see penguins. Penguins exist north of the equator because the equator goes through the Galapagos and penguins move across it. So that means that this penguin here, this Galapagos penguin, is breeding in one of the hottest environments on Earth. So somehow evolution in just a few million years has created this massive radiation of organisms that can live under the most diverse set, almost the most diverse set of breeding conditions on Earth. So evolution can do a ton of stuff. The question is, what will evolution do as we change the world around us? Will it create a buffering system that saves biodiversity, or will it fail? So I want to start then with sort of two basic recognitions before I talk about evolution. And the first recognition is really that biodiversity is cool. I think that probably every human being on Earth would agree to this fact. They may not like mosquitoes or a particular disease or COVID-19 or whatever, but generally biodiversity is pretty cool. And I've loved biodiversity for ages. I take a lot of photographs. These are animals that I photographed over the years. I share tons and tons of videos and pictures on various social media platforms. So I am a real advocate and a real buy-in to the fact that biodiversity is just cool. I can appreciate it for itself. But it's not just that. Biodiversity is actually really useful and important and indeed critical for people. Everything we eat, everything we build, every interaction we have with the world is influenced by biodiversity. And we are an exceptionally depauperate group of organisms if we do not have the full scope of biodiversity. So here, for example, is a recent enumeration of the various things that are called nature's contributions to people, which used to be called ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are subsumed within this. Okay, so biodiversity is super cool. We like watching biodiversity, looking at it, and it's really important. So therefore, presumably, you, like me, are concerned with this announcement that you surely have saw within the last 3 or 4 years that 1 million species are at risk of extinction. So where did that number come from? Well, I happen to actually have been involved in the process that came up with that number, and it's from a UN Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And so a bunch of scientists met and came up with an assessment of biodiversity and all of its interactions with people, what the state of biodiversity was, and what we could do to preserve it moving forward. Now, the particular part of this assessment that had the 1 million species that were at risk of extinction is right here. It's one line. I'm sure you guys all work with the media, and there's just that one phrase that they want to highlight. So in this massive document, it's that one sentence that all the press highlighted. Now, I want to return to this document later because the contribution that I made to it was really about how rapid evolution might influence this number and the consequences for people. But for the moment, I want to return to the penguin, the Galapagos penguin, and penguins more generally. I just told you that penguins have somehow, in a reasonable amount of time, from a single common ancestor, evolved a vast diversity of species that inhabit incredibly diverse environments. So clearly, penguins, in this one lineage as an example, have been able to adapt to a great diversity of different conditions. So, as humans change the world and have all these negative impacts on the environment, why can't evolution just save all these species we have around us and therefore preserve their contributions to people? So that's basically the premise of my talk. Now, of course, the original explanation for why evolution is not going to save the world is that it's too slow, right? It takes millions of years. Now, we know this is true because Darwin said it. So if you look in The Origin of Species, there are some really classic passages, such as, "We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the long lapse of ages." Or, "She," meaning natural selection, "can never take a leap, but must advance by the shortest and slowest steps." So Darwin is the demigod of all evolutionary biologists and all biologists, so what Darwin says kind of goes. And indeed, this was the received wisdom for a very long period of time. So everyone accepted that evolution has generated all of life's diversity over the billions of years of evolution that have been unfolding. But now we're concerned with much shorter time frames, right? So what is evolution going to do over centuries, decades, years, the things that are of interest to us as living humans and to our immediate descendants? Now, we know that rapid evolution is actually a thing, right? So you all know about the evolution of antibiotic resistance, antiviral resistance, the evolution of resistance to chemotherapy targets, evolution of resistance to pesticides and herbicides. And on the right there, you see a time-lapse simulation of the evolution of resistance in E. coli as it adapts to an antibiotic gradient on a gel. And they can basically make it step by step to evolve to the highest level of antibiotics that are given to them in that particular treatment. And you can trace the evolutionary lineage of the specific mutations that are involved in adaptation to that antibiotic. Now, I'm not going to talk about that because I think pretty much everyone agrees that these small, short-lived organisms are evolving like crazy, and it really matters. Right, I mean, COVID-19, we had the original flavor, right? Then we had, what was it, the Delta variant, then we had the Omicron, and then what, Omicron B something or other, and so that's evolution, right? So everybody knows that. But what I'm concerned with is the evolution of things out in nature, macroorganisms, larger organisms with longer time spans, longer lifespans. And so I want to start just by giving you some really concrete examples where this rapid evolution has been shown for these types of organisms, some of which will probably be familiar. Now, the main gist of my talk will be that humans are really changing the environment so much that evolution is just run off the rails. It's going crazy now. But rapid evolution is occurring even in natural variation. And one of the canonical examples of this is Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. So on that small island up there, which is Daphne Major, a couple of professors and their students have studied the finch populations for 35 years. And they showed that as conditions changed, El Nino, La Nina conditions that influenced plants that were available, which then caused the evolution of beak size. And so, for instance, during a major drought, there was a really big jump upward in the size of the beaks of the Darwin's finches. So this isn't humans sitting on that island doing something specifically to those organisms. It's just natural variation that we know occurs without any direct human influence. But humans, of course, have really changed everything quite dramatically. We were just arguing about the 9 billion humans, right? And how evolution is basically buffering against that. So here's one example, right? Climate change, global warming. So a whole bunch of organisms are breeding earlier now that things are warmer. Some of that breeding earlier is just a plastic response to the perceived warmer conditions. Individuals say, oh, it's warmer now, so I'm going to breed now. But part of it is evolution. And here's one example. These are red squirrels in the Yukon Territory, and breeding time is really advancing dramatically in the last several decades. And because the entire population is pedigreed, you can separate out the evolutionary part of that increase, of that advancing reproductive time. And that's just what the bottom graph is showing. So they are evolving earlier reproduction as a result of the ecological changes associated with global warming. Now, global warming is happening across the globe, but it's a very sort of a diffuse effect. That is, we are all putting carbon dioxide in the environment. It's warming up the Earth, albeit heterogeneously across the Earth. But it's not a local targeted effect on the organism. You don't go out and apply heating. You don't put your carbon dioxide around big sky, right? Our carbon dioxide we emit here doesn't stay around big sky. It spreads out. So there are a number of other human influences that are very much more direct. That is, they're targeting a local population. And some of the best examples are where humans are deliberately acting as predators and killing them for sport or for food. Now, you might have seen the bighorn sheep as you drove up the road. This is, or down the road for that matter. This is one of the best examples of how direct target of a particular trait, that is the size of the horns of the bighorn sheep, is causing the evolution of that trait. So on particular populations, hunters are only allowed to kill bighorn sheep where the curl is full. It has to pass the eye. And so that means that hunters are selectively killing the fastest growing, largest males. As a result, you've had the evolution of smaller horn size. This is just the overall phenotypic trend, that is the trend in the trait, and this is the trend in the genetic component of that trait. So this is the evolutionary representation of this trait change. So there's a really dramatic response to the harvesting of this population in the specific trait that is being harvested. And you see the percentage change. The average was 70 centimeters, and now it's something like 45. So it's a massive change. Now, another instance where humans are acting as predators is things like fish harvesting, right? And so we know that in the cod on the east coast of North America, there was a huge increase in harvest rate, and then a collapse of the fishery, and it still hasn't recovered. Part of the reason it hasn't recovered is that during that process, when humans were killing the largest, oldest cod, the cod evolved smaller size at reproduction, which means they have many fewer eggs, and therefore it's harder for the population to recover. And we've shown in some work that the intensity of harvesting has an effect on the rate at which fish get smaller. Again, some of this is just sort of plastic responses to growth opportunities, and some of it is evolution. Those are examples, right? But maybe those are the only 4 I could come up with. Maybe I haven't really I've just given you exceptions. So we did a whole bunch of work trying to understand how general this phenomenon was. And to do so, we needed a rate of evolutionary change that we could quantify for many, many studies that have examined populations through time. And the particular metric that I'm going to show you here is simply the change in the average value of the trait through time in units of standard deviations of that trait per generation. So it's a shift in the average value in standard deviation units per generation. If you use that metric, you can calculate rates of change for traits of organisms of all kinds of different traits and all kinds of different organisms. And ask if general patterns emerge for how rates of evolutionary change are influenced by various types of human disturbance. The first comparison of this we did in 2008 was we had 65 studies with 45 species where we could divide the rates of change into those that were obviously the result of a human disturbance, such as hunting and harvesting, for example, and those where there was no obvious human disturbance. So for the sake of argument, we can call those natural. And we asked the question, is the rate of change in these traits greater when humans are directly impacting the population than when they're not? We all have this general perception that humans are the sort of the greatest purveyor of ecological change on Earth, so that should therefore cause the greatest rate of response in the organisms, which should therefore be manifest as the greatest rate of response in the evolution of their traits. So what I'm going to do is show you a graph here with one data point per study where the data points are categorized by whether or not they're human disturbed, so red point, and not human disturbed or more natural in blue. And so this is the amount of change over a certain time interval, and the expectation then is that the red points should be higher than the blue points, right? So the magnitude of change for a given time interval should be greater when humans are directly impacting the population than when they're not. So what do the data show? Partly, right? Because if you see, there's a lot of instances where when humans are impacting the population, there's not a lot of change. So it's not a universal thing. But almost all of the high points are human stuff. So the extreme rates of trait change are generally associated with human impacts on populations. But not all human impacts are the same, and I earlier made the distinction between diffuse impacts like climate change and direct impacts like harvesting. So other people came and analyzed these rates of change in traits in relation to that dichotomy by asking, are rates of change the most dramatic when humans are acting as predators? Which you might expect because humans are generally selecting against the largest individuals. And so if you compile the data like that, indeed, the largest rates of change are when humans are directly selecting on specific traits that are being measured, such as body size or horn size or things like that. Now, these were early analyses. We've subsequently gone back to this and generated a much larger data set. I'm not going to spend much time on it, except to say that the general conclusions of the earlier analyses have been maintained. That is, particular types of human disturbance, such as hunting and harvesting, seem to show the largest change in the older data set as well as the new data set. And also some other types of human disturbance that we didn't analyze previously are also jumping out as being important. So on the right, you see the magnitude of change along the x-axis, and all of those are individual data points for all of the traits in all of the studies for all of the organisms. And pollution, responses to pollution, and responses to invasive species are things that are also jumping out as being very big influences on rates of change in traits. Now, I have a second part of my talk, which is about whether any of this matters. These are just traits, right? But does it impact ecosystems or humans? Before I do that, I want to go back to Darwin, because I sort of set him up as a straw man, right? And said that he said everything was slow, and therefore we believed him, and therefore we all thought everything was slow until recently. But I'm not convinced that's the case. Now, in The Origin of Species, there's a single figure, just one, and this is it. And it's a hypothetical phylogeny where you have several different species along the bottom, and they're diversifying through time increments going up here, leading to a number of other species at the top after those 14 time units. So there's a lot of stuff going on in each time unit, and there's a ton of stuff that's occurred over those 14 time units. What are those time units? Right? I mean, are they millions of years? Tens of millions of years? thousands of years? Well, there's one place in the Origin of Species where he says what those time intervals are. And here's the phrase. After 14,000 generations, 6 new species are supposed to have been produced. So he's saying that in only 14,000 generations, you go from 1 species to 6, with a ton of stuff happening in each of those individual 1,000-year generations. Now, for an annual organism, that's since the last glaciation, right? So that's a ton of evolution that has occurred on a relatively short time span. So I personally feel that we're actually converging back on what Darwin really thought was the rate of evolution, and that's that it's actually pretty fast after all. And in fact, the co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, was even more extreme here, thinking that new species could evolve in less than 100 years. Okay. This has all been about traits, like individual traits, body size, time of reproduction, things like that, beak size in Darwin's finches. But the question here is, does this matter for any emergent things about the system? Does it influence the community of organisms that a particular evolving species is interacting with? Does it influence the ecosystem that that thing is found in? And does it influence people that are interacting with those organisms? So the second part of my talk is about trying to explore that. And in fact, this is the part of my research that I'm really focusing on right now. I wrote a book about this. If you got money to burn, go ahead and buy it. And the basic argument here is that there's a bunch of ecological dynamics that are taking place at the population level, the communities of organisms at the ecosystem level. That's causing the rapid changes in phenotypes, some of which is evolutionary. And then as those traits change, those phenotypes, the traits of organisms change, it feeds back to change the ecological processes. But I have to confess that my favorite part about writing a book was the hashtag that came out of this, which my good friend generated, which was called "People Who Fell Asleep Reading My Book." And so I have a wonderful collection of famous evolutionary biologists and ecologists falling asleep with my book. One of your Harvard colleagues is there, former Harvard colleagues. Okay, so thinking about this then, I've said before that these ecological changes often wrought by humans, populations, at the population, community, or ecosystem level are changing the traits of organisms, right? That's what I just said. These arrows coming up here. But now I'm asking feedbacks. As those traits change, is that influencing the population dynamics of organisms, their communities, and ecosystems? So let's ask first, does evolution change the population dynamics of species? One manifestation of this is the concept of evolutionary rescue. Now, if you consider some population, it has a large population size, and then perhaps pollution hits it, or it gets harvested, or an invasive species comes in and it's not adapted to that condition, so the population size declines. But then as it declines, evolution is trying to adapt it to that new condition. So the rate of decline in population size is expected to decrease. Now, in some instances, that rate of decline may arrest itself and recover the population back to its original state. So it has now evolved back to the original abundance. It's evolutionary rescue. In other cases, the rate of decline is so steep that they cannot recover by evolution and they go extinct. So the question is, does evolution really do this? And to be honest, it's kind of a moot point because really, we're all here because evolution has saved all of our ancestors. All the species alive today have been rescued by evolution countless times in their history. But of course, we'd like an experimental demonstration of this as well. So this has been done in the laboratory by a couple of colleagues of mine at McGill, where they expose yeast populations to high salt content, which kills a lot of them. But then they have a series of mutations that basically recovers population size and rescues the population through evolution. But I would argue that this is yeast in the lab where nothing else is going on, and so what's the point, really? So I want to know, does this happen in the real world? So this is the major thrust of what I'm interested in. And so I'm going to give you some specific examples of our attempt to ask how much rapid evolution matters for populations, communities, ecosystems, and people in the real, messy, complicated world. So for this population dynamic part, I want to take you to Trinidad, which is definitely a real world. And although it's heavily impacted by people, the northern slope of the mountain range in the northern part of Trinidad is quite pristine. And in those streams lives a very good evolutionary model system called the guppy. These are the same ones you find in your aquarium, although they're the fancy guppies now that have been bred in captivity for many years. But they live in the wild. Now, we wanted to ask, there's some guppies swimming around in nature in Trinidad. We wanted to ask, how much will rapid evolution influence their ability to survive given an environmental disturbance? And so we did an experiment in nature where we took one ancestral source population, the rivers are the arrows, and then the circle represents the source population, an ancestor. And then we took those and introduced them into a river where there were no guppies that was right beside it, in two different places. So the green and blue are newly introduced guppies that are in a new environment. And then we just waited 7 years, which is approximately 25 generations for guppies. And then we went back and we asked, how much better do those derived green and blue populations do in their new homes than their ancestors would have done in those homes? So we basically collected all the fish again, individually marked them, and then introduced the ancestors and descendants back into the descendant environment. So now we can compare the survival of the ones that have been evolving here for 7 years to the representatives of their ancestors, and the same for the green population. So we can ask about not just the evolution of traits, but the evolution of survival. So we came back and assessed how well they survived. And so you've got this estimate of survival rate at the two locations for the ancestors and for the two descendant populations that have been evolving there. And the blue line, the blue bars are going to be higher than the green bars, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't be presenting it to you. But the shrug there is an appropriate one, because how much higher? Should we take a poll? Okay, I'll give you three numbers. I don't know, 1% higher, 10% higher, 50% higher, 75% higher. So this means that that's how much evolution has improved their survival. Okay, wait. So raise your hand. So it's going to be 1, 10, what did I say? 1, 10, 50, and 75. Let's say 125, 50, and 75, okay? So 1%. 25%. 50%. 75%. So it seems like most people are guessing 50%, but the main point is nobody has a fucking clue. On average, nobody has a clue. And to be honest, I had no idea either. So what is the number? I mean, you're sitting here going, you don't know what it's going to be. I don't know what it's going to be. 50%. On average? No, actually, I'm not sure the mean was correct, but definitely the mode was correct in this room. Okay, so there's been a massive improvement in their ability to survive in that environment after only 7 years. Okay, great. The traits of organisms should influence their ability to persist in that environment, but what about effects on the rest of the environment? So for that, we're asking now not just about how phenotypes and the changes in those are influencing the populations of the things that are evolving, but the rest of the community and the whole ecosystem. Now, the way I want to do this is I want to start by just giving you a meta-analysis where we took many studies and tried to address this question by comparing shorter-term evolution with longer-term evolution. So you can easily imagine how the amount of time it took different species to evolve is greater than the amount of time that it took different types to evolve within species. So we can compare the ecological effects of different species to the ecological effects of different types within species. Now, we know species matter, right? We know species change the environment. But how important is it which type of that species you pick. Big or small, one population or another, one genotype or another. Is that as important as whether the species is present or which species it is? So it turns out that a whole bunch of studies have done this. So what they do is they do experiments in controlled settings like what are like mesocosms, so like tanks of water or common gardens for plants. And they have treatments where they have one species or another, and then for each of those species, they have two types, so genotype 1 or genotype 2. And they ask, how big is the species effect on the ecological variable we're interested in versus the effect of the genotypes within the species? And so we can compile all that and ask the question, just how important is this variation within species? So for each individual response variable, which varied a lot among studies, here's a list of the types of variables that people are measuring. We can say for each study, we can have one point that represents the magnitude of how important the species effect is, the longer-term evolution, and how important the variation within the species is. So the one-to-one line, the dotted line, would mean that species are equally as important as what type of an individual you pick within that species. Below the line, it means that species are more important, right? So it matters whether you have a lion or a tiger rather than whether that tiger is from Sumatra or India. Up here would be the opposite case, that actually it's more important whether you have a tiger for Sumatra or India versus a lion, right? So obviously that's nonsense, right? Clearly, species are going to be much more important than which genotype or population of that species you use, right? I would do another poll, but I'm sure I have time. So there's a whole bunch of data here. Where do they fall? They should fall below that line, right? But they don't. So yes, sometimes species effects are much bigger. The longer-term evolution is more important. But a whole bunch of times, it matters more which genotype of a species you put in the experiment than it does what species you put in that experiment. Which means that short-term evolution has done a whole bunch of stuff that influences the environment. Which means that we should look at it more closely. Now, to be honest, this is one of my studies, and I just don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is these were the ecosystems. They're cattle tanks and controlled plots in fields. So I don't believe it at all, to be honest. So my main emphasis, as I said, is to ask about this in natural systems. Now, I just want to tell you about some of the work we're doing rather than give you the results of that work. The first place, so we're doing it in guppies. I already talked to you about guppies, right? On the lower left. The upper left is a three-spined stickleback, a small fish in the northern hemisphere. And we're also working on Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands. So I just want to mention the Galapagos work because it's a really cool system. It's a very simplified system. Relatively few species are there, all descendant from just a few colonists from the mainland. They diversify on the islands and then evolve in response to the conditions on each island. And then that evolution feeds back to change the conditions on those islands. And we specifically focus on the Darwin's finches and the radiation of Darwin's finches. 14 species shown here, all that evolved within approximately 1 million years. And their interactions with plants. So here's a finch that's seeking out a difficult to open woody fruit and getting the seeds out of that fruit. This is a very difficult interaction for both the bird and for the seed. And we've shown that basically that predation of the finches on the seeds is changing the community of plants and causing the evolution of the individual species of plant, which then changes the evolution of the finches, which then changes the community of plants, which then causes the evolution of the finches, and so on. But instead of talking about that, I want to go to a system where we can be more experimental. So we need to move from the Galapagos and terrestrial systems and move our way to Alaska and aquatic systems. And I'm going to describe an experiment here without giving you the outcome. You'll have to subscribe to those fancy periodicals to hear the outcome in the years to come. But we can do this really, really cool experiment to ask if short-term rapid evolution is structuring communities and ecosystems in the real messy world. And this work also focuses on irradiation, and this is irradiation of 3-spined stickleback fishes that have an ancestral marine form there in the middle that then colonizes different freshwater environments after the last glaciation, evolves dramatically different phenotypes, that is, traits in response to those different conditions. And we want to know, what are the ecological effects of that evolution? Now, I want to emphasize that these are real lakes, right? So this is one of our study lakes, and it's actual real lakes out there on the landscape. Now, the reason we can do this is because we have cool 10 experimental lakes that have no stickleback in them. And why they have no stickleback in them is because of Bob the pike, the northern pike. There he is. There's Bob. Now, I have to emphasize that I am saying Bob because that pike, Bob there, is personally responsible for the extinction of all the other fish in that little pond. No, I don't mean pike generally. I mean that one right there. So they don't belong in these lakes. Fishermen introduce them. They're really good predators. The fish that are there don't know how to deal with them. They cause the extinction of all the other fish. So then the Alaska Department of Fish and Game goes in and says, well, we got to get rid of the invaders and restore the lakes. So they poison the lakes to get rid of all of the fish, including the pike. And then we have 10 empty lakes. And we said, hey, let's leverage this variation within stickleback, this massive variation, and put different types of stickleback into the different lakes and see what effects they have. And we're specifically looking at stickleback that tend to forage in the open water, called limnetic, on zooplankton, versus stickleback that forage on the bottom of the lake, benthic feeders, on benthic macroinvertebrates. And I'm not going to give you the experimental design. Happy to talk to you about it, but it's a massive experiment. 16,000 individual fish photographed and fin clips taken for DNA analysis. But I'll just show you the cool thing where we're taking this empty lake and we're actually introducing one of our experimental treatments into it. And you see our happy experimental stickleback swimming off to make us all rich and famous and restore the lake and have major ecological effects. Let's just watch it till the end. I don't care if I go over time because it's just cool to watch these fish swim over. I mean, look at that. Isn't that amazing? Okay, so we're measuring a bunch of stuff, seeing how these different types of stickleback and their evolution after we put them in the lakes is structuring the entire lake ecosystem. I just want to close now, in the few minutes that I have, with a question about whether this matters beyond zooplankton and benthic macroinvertebrates, whatever those are, and does it matter for people? So people live around these lakes, and we have the expectation that a bunch of the effects of these two types of stickleback will actually change how people interact with those lakes. But I want to give you a more concrete example for which we actually have data, and that is for salmon. So let's go back to the consideration of how the traits of organisms are responding to human disturbances and ask what's happening to salmon in Alaska, not stickleback. So we did a huge analysis of time series of the size of salmon across many populations and regions in Alaska and how that's changing through time with these 4 species here. And in essence, they're all getting smaller. Salmon are in the North Pacific and in Alaska are getting roughly 10% smaller over the last 20 years. Moreover, this decrease in size is accelerating in the recent decades. So here are fitted lines for each of the different species, and you can see that they really drop off in recent years. So massive changes in this huge data set for many different populations. Now, these size declines, like I said, are accelerating in recent decades. Moreover, we've been able to show that some of this change is just because the feeding conditions are changing in the ocean. It's not evolution. But we've also been able to show that some of this change is evolutionary. Of course, it's not the genes that matter for the organisms that are interacting with the salmon, it's the traits of the salmon that matter, right? So the question is then, what effects will these changes have on ecosystems and people? So we've estimated this in 4 different components. The first thing is, how will this affect the reproduction of salmon? That is, the number of eggs produced. So as salmon gets smaller, they're going to produce fewer eggs, and it's an exponential relationship between size and number of eggs. So a small decrease in size could have a big decrease in the number of eggs produced. And indeed, across all of the species, by the way, the gray points are different populations, you see a decline in the number of eggs produced up to 1,000. So they're producing many fewer eggs because they're now smaller. Salmon are also bringing all these resources back into fresh water that all the organisms in fresh water depend on, and that can be indexed as the amount of phosphorus they're bringing back from the ocean and depositing in fresh water, and that's declining for all these populations. What about people now? So commercial fishermen, the value you get per pound of salmon depends on the size of the salmon. And so indeed, the value per fish is decreasing in US dollars, as estimated there. What about indigenous people? So we can estimate the number of meals per fish. And if you do that, you see that there's a substantial decrease in the number of meals per fish for indigenous people. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up now by bringing this back together and saying that I started out with these 1 million species that are going extinct, and these considerations I've just given you are in fact being incorporated into this global assessment. Just a few lines later is the part that I wrote, which is about human-induced changes are creating conditions for fast biological evolution that is having major impacts for ecosystems and people. So the things I'm telling you today are being incorporated into management and policy. In summary then, what can evolution do and what can't it do in this changing world? Things it can do, or is it can/will save some populations and species from extinction. Moreover, it will preserve some of the positive contributions of nature to ecosystems and people. But it cannot save all species and populations, and it cannot preserve all the benefits of those species. For instance, the salmon are evolving. It's going to benefit the salmon, but it's not benefiting the people that are interacting with the salmon, because the salmon are now smaller. So that's this idea that evolution won't always help, and sometimes it's going to hurt us moving forward. So the general point is that everything is evolving all the time, and we need a lot more work to figure out where this evolution is most rapid and where it's not, where it will save species and where it won't, and what effects it will have on entire communities, ecosystems, and people. And so we'll just end. I'm done, but this is basically our Galapagos field research where we're doing a bunch of work in the remote wilds of Galapagos. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have a time for a few questions.
What about secondary human effects, like killing the predators of a particular species? How does that affect the evolution of those species?
Yeah, so the question, I'll generalize it, is basically sort of you can have cascading effects where if we kill the predators, now basically we might be releasing a bunch of species from predation effects. And there is that some of the evidence in the data set is that because by killing most of the large predators, such as sharks or even whales and also large carnivores, you are seeing evolutionary responses in their former prey species. So that is one of the evolutionary responses that people document. I think you had your hand up first.
In the guppy experiment, did you consider putting the guppies back from River 2 into River 1 to see how they could survive as compared to the original? Because I imagine if they were better at surviving, maybe they evolved more generic survival skills. If they were worse, then it's purely environmental, which could influence the results for understanding how the species go too.
There's always the person in the audience who points out the flaw in the experimental design that you deliberately didn't mention. So if you remember the guppy experiment, you saw that it wasn't a fully reciprocal transplant. We didn't take the descendant populations and put them back in the ancestral environment. Maybe it's not local adaptation to that environment. Maybe they've just evolved to be generally better. We can't do that experiment because the ancestral environment is a much larger environment where recapture rates would be too low to actually assess that. So we know they evolved, but we don't know if it's specific evolution to that local site. Were you reviewer number 3? You were reviewer number 3, right?
Yeah. So we have time for one more, and then we...
Okay, sure. I'll be around if you want to ask questions after, but...
Yeah.
Maybe a little abstruse, but just thinking about what would cause things to go faster from the point of view of like genetics and
Yeah.
autosomal things. Do you have a part of your team looking at like epigenetics and
Yeah.
what that would be doing?
Yeah, okay, so I like rephrasing questions so that I can answer them, so I'll do that. So I'll just turn it into a statement rather than answer the question. So you notice I didn't talk about DNA, right? I didn't talk about allele frequencies or epigenetics or any of that. We do work on all of that, but in reality, it's the traits of organisms that matter for how they interact with the environment. So now, what is generally emerging from the genetic work that we and many other people are doing is that for most organisms, it's whether you have a lot of variation that's already in the population, called standing genetic variation. Then you have by far the most rapid evolution. And also, so you don't want to wait for new mutations. Epigenetics can have effects as well, but they don't really last as long as the media would like you to think. So, but you also, if you have large effect genes, that tends to also lead to more rapid evolutionary responses. So rather than having 1,000 genes that are causing a change in a particular trait, if you have one and it has lots of variation to start with, then that's where you see the most rapid changes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that concludes track 1 for tonight. If you could clear the room as quickly as possible, that would allow us to set up for the regular sessions and set up the air walls. Thank you.